Well, joining me now from London is Alex Cobham. He's the Chief Executive for the Tax Justice Network and a trustee for ActionAid, an NGO working to combat poverty. And in New Delhi is Rajneesh Narula. He's an international business regulation professor at the University of Reading's Henley Business School. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Alex Cobham, let me start with you. So Oxfam comes out with this report. They tell us the 26 richest people on earth in 2018 had the same net worth as the poorest half of the world's population. Is that consistent with everything that you've seen and all the work you do?
Absolutely. You know, the Tax Justice Network exists to track and to try to fight the processes of tax avoidance and tax evasion and the rigging of the rules that give us this race to the bottom on taxation and regulation, all of which result in the greater concentration of political power, of wealth and of income. So these numbers moving in this direction are entirely consistent with that.
Right.
And I'm afraid we can only expect it to get worse.
Right. The Centre for Global Development and Credit Suisse have their own studies and they question Oxfam's numbers a little bit. They agree. The inequality is bad. Clearly, there's a problem, right? So we won't get into the semantics of the numbers and just how many billionaires are there, you know, that are holding so much or how much of the world's wealth. But why would you say that this is directly linked to not taxing people enough?
Oh, look, we know that when you're talking about billions of people living in abject poverty and a few people with billions more than they could ever conceivably spend in their lifetime, you know that there's a problem. If aliens were to arrive on the planet today and look at us and think about the difference between where we are now and where we could be in terms of, reaching the human capacity, the opportunities that we all have, if we were to distribute things a bit more equally, they'd laugh at us. They'd think we were crazy for having chosen this extreme radical inequality that we have. This is really about whether or not governments at national level and through international coordination are willing to make the decisions challenging their own elites that will ensure that the elites are a little bit less distant from everyone else and the people at the bottom in the middle are a little bit higher up, have better opportunities for health and education and so on, which would make the planet, a much better place and our own human achievements all the better for us.
Rajneesh Narula, those very elites are sitting in Davos trying to come up with solutions to this inequality. Do you trust them?
No, not at all. I don't think I think the problem is much more complicated than that. It's not enough just to increase taxes or try and tax rich people, because there's also, these are people in different countries and across countries, and you have the problem within countries. The big problem really here is how is efficient government policies that actually do something rather than collecting taxes. Getting more money or making the rich poorer isn't the solution.
Rajneesh, for those who say clearly capitalism has failed, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, do they have a point?
Completely. This is very much about globalization. Much of what we see going on, the election of Trump's policies, populist approaches, Brexit, these reflect a large percentage of the population not being happy with their opportunities, their standards of living, the quality of their lives, what they can expect, the high level of uncertainty because of now we have the gig economy, flexible employment, not enough pensions. So all of these problems have made people concerned about this, and they're reacting to this. So yes, there is a problem.
Yeah, Alex Cobham, are we entering a new age of feudalism?
What we've seen is governments in rich countries as well as in lower income countries effectively acquiescing in the undermining of direct taxation by failing to challenge the tax avoidance of multinational companies and the offshore tax evasion of their own elites, which cost something between $400 and $700 billion each year in lost revenue around the world. Governments are accepting that they're going to leave people at the bottom without health and education, without income, sometimes without even sufficient food, simply because they won't challenge this system. Now, until we do that, we're really not going to see significant progress against inequality within countries or between countries. The international inequality in the distribution of taxing rights favours high-income countries over low-income countries, and that has to be challenged. Now, if the question is whether we expect the people in Davos, the very people who benefit most from this unjust system, to be the ones who lead the charge for change, I think we're kidding ourselves. We need to be looking at a different type of politics that will see people take back control and look to re-establish the social contract.
But you're saying, sorry to interrupt you, Alex, but you're saying we need a new politics, right? Those who vote for the likes of Trump or Bolsonaro are saying this is precisely what we're doing. So Bolsonaro is in Davos, and Bolsonaro and his supporters in Brazil would say the previous government implemented the very suggestions that Oxfam had. The previous government went and had these health and social programs and said we need higher taxation, and they screwed up our economy and they took away our growth, and that's why we need a new Brazil and we need to reimpose new thinking. Can you understand why the populists would look at new thinking as the solution, which is fundamentally diametrically opposed to what you're thinking?
Oh, sure. This kind of disaster capitalism creates the conditions to some extent for its own continuation. But we have to recognise that the inequality we're talking about isn't just economic, it's also political. What you've seen in these countries that you mentioned, for example, is the growing influence of money on results and an acceptance that a rigging of the political rules is basically okay. Until we take out a lot of both the dirty money and the corporate money from our politics, we're going to continue to allow elections to be bought, as we've seen in countries around the world. And that means we'll never see a politics that reflects the desire for redistribution, which is actually present among the majority of people in most countries.
Rajneesh, as we look at solutions, right, do you think that the fact that socialism and communism had such spectacular failures over the past 100 years or so means that anytime somebody tries to question the status quo right now, you can point to the gulags and the tens of millions of people killed and say, well, clearly this system's the best system, so we need to soldier on and keep on going. Is that what happens, or, you know, whenever you try to think of creative solutions?
Well, you know, I agree with my esteemed colleague here that something has to be done. The system is no longer fit for purpose. What I'm not entirely certain that I agree with is whether taxes are going to solve the problem. It's what you do with the taxes that matters. And one of the problems is we're functioning in a system where you have people who are not skilled for the jobs that are available out there. So we're moving to a world in the rich countries, for instance, where we don't need factory workers, we don't need farmers as much. Now, these farmers, these factory workers need to be trained or retrained in some way. And some of them are 50 years old or 40 years old and so forth. How do you retrain a farmer to be a dentist or a doctor or an engineer? It's quite difficult. Who picks up the cost? And here comes the tax issue. How do you use the money that is raised? It's not enough to raise more taxes or to stop the corporate buyout of politicians, but how you use the money that's raised efficiently in the 21st century. It isn't enough to have more universities. It's about having the right kinds of education for the times we are in. And I think this is a very, very important point. How is this money going to be spent? So there are no ideas coming out. Nobody wants to talk about how the education system needs to be modified, how lifelong learning is important, how people are living to be 90 years old, but they retire at 55 or 60 or 65. Who pays their pension, their health services, and so forth? So poverty gets created because we're thinking with a set of rules that come from perhaps the beginning of the 20th century or the middle of the 20th century. But these are things that no longer, the world doesn't function in quite the same way.
Mm-hmm. Alex, do we have to have different rules for different systems? So, okay, in Western industrialized country where there is strong rule of law, maybe you can tax the elite or the super rich at a higher rate, and that money can be used for better things. But that can't apply in a country where there's rampant political corruption, because, you know, that's just more money to the government, and that's oiling the pockets or lining the pockets of the elite.
No, that's exactly the wrong way round. And this is a problem that we've had for a long time, that way of thinking. The International Monetary Fund, although in the last 10 years it's really improved its position, for a long time it pushed this tax consensus that said, look, direct taxes, taxes on incomes, profits and capital gains, they're really too difficult for lower income countries. So they shouldn't worry about that. They should do perhaps trade taxes, but ideally sales taxes, VAT. The effect of that is not only do you raise less revenue in countries that need it most, but actually you have a regressive tax system, so you also have higher inequality than you need to. And worst of all, is actually direct taxes, the evidence shows, that create the strongest link between people and their governments, that builds the social contract. So you have much better political representation when people are paying direct taxes. You know, the taxes that hurt, you don't notice VAT, but you notice the PAYE that comes out of your salary each month, and then you hold government to account. So where you have systems with higher direct taxes, you have much less corruption. In fact, we need to start thinking, as finally has begun to happen, about tax as an input to a good system of government. So if you get taxes right, you don't just have more money, you spend the money better because you have less corruption. And this is one of very few things actually in the world that turns out to be associated with less corruption.
Alex,
we should really make use of it.
Right, there seems to be a paradox here globally in terms of the trends, because on the one hand, yes, inequality is widening and deepening, and perhaps especially in Western industrialized countries, wages are depreciating year after year, decade after decade. People tend to suffer and slipping out of the middle class and so on. Yet in some parts of the world, extreme poverty is being eradicated. Both these things seem to be happening simultaneously. How do you explain that?
So the extreme poverty numbers are contested, let's say. We know a lot of the story is about China opening up its economy. So it has very little to do with policy decisions taken anywhere else in the world. And outside of that, the numbers actually are much less clear, although there seems to be progress in terms of the very most extreme poverty. But those poverty lines are about people living on much less income than any human should have to live on. If you look at a higher poverty line that's closer to some kind of a standard of living, the progress is much less obvious. So we still have a long way to go. And of course, inequality patterns vary by country and by region over time. There's not a single pattern happening in the world. But if we look at Western countries that have faced the financial crisis and often pursued austerity, if we take the UK as an example, what we see is a real extreme step backwards. You know, the UK has cut its corporate income tax. It's reduced other taxes too, especially direct taxes. And it's seen this very sharp jump in vulnerability and poverty. In one of the richest countries in the world, we've done that to ourselves by choice. And that's really a shocking thing to say about any government. And that's exactly why we've seen this rise in a populist sentiment that says there has to be better than this. There has to be an enemy that I can say causes this and lets me be better if I can get free of it, which of course is not the right answer, but it's understandable that that's what people turn to. Yeah,
fundamentally, a lot of people, wondering, is this the invisible hand of the market, or is it a nefarious plot? And nefarious plot becomes a very kind of easy answer for many. Rajneesh, very finally, on a slightly lighter note, guess how many private jets flew into Davos this year?
I think between 200 and 300.
1,500 private jets arrived at Davos this year, 50% more than last year. I'll let that be the final word in the discussion. Gentlemen, good to have you on the Newsmakers. Looking forward to having you on the program again. Thanks for joining us.